Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Wilhelmina FitzClarence. The Crimson Portrait. I sat motionless for some moments, and then looked again. Yes, it was there still. So, with a beating heart, I rose from my writing table and approached it. But as I got nearer, it seemed to get fainter. Hastily pressing forward, and putting out my hand as though to grasp, to retain it, it was no longer there. It was very strange, and I felt extremely agitated, but with some amount of courage I again sat down to my writing, determined to collect my scared senses and to watch. Before, however, describing what followed, I will give as condensed a history as I can of the singular picture which had thus alarmed me. It had belonged to the late lord, my husband's father, who had died under peculiar circumstances, leaving his affairs in much confusion. Owing, however, to the blessed law of entail, he was unable to ruin his heir, as he undoubtedly wished to do, for he and his eldest son, my husband, had never been on good terms. Indeed, I should not be guilty of exaggeration were I to say that they had ever been on the very worst, and this bitterness between father and son had much increased during the last few years, because the latter had stoutly refused to entertain the former's wish that the entail should be broken. My husband loved and clung to the places and things with which he had been familiar all his life. Besides, he knew, as did his brothers, whom he consulted, that his father, in suggesting such a thing, was prompted by no honorable motive. "As I am the last in entail," said my husband, "it rests with me to prevent the squandering of the fortune or the selling of the heirlooms that have been ours for generations." "My father," answered Leo, the youngest brother, bitterly, "says he wishes to pay some debt of honor, but I doubt the honor. No, he means to pay for another fling before old age, and the inability to enjoy himself shall overtake him." "Ah," said Reginald, the second brother, "don't talk to me of honor. I can never forget our poor mother's broken heart and subsequent death. He wants money, of course, to provide for that." "Well, well," hastily interrupted my husband, "it cannot be my duty to injure all of you." And thus it was agreed, to the old lord's great disappointment, that the entail should not be broken. For centuries the family had owned, besides houses and land, many heirlooms, such as jewels, pictures, rare china, and historical furniture, and when my husband's father became aware that his son would not give up his right to these things, he, possessing amongst other delightful qualities a most revengeful disposition, determined to pay out his heir for thus coercing him, and set to work to do so after the following ingenious fashion. Upon different plausible excuses, he packed up many of the portable heirlooms in boxes. He also dismounted and rolled up some of the priceless paintings, for their better security, he declared, if ever he found it necessary to explain his actions, and put them all under the charge of individuals with whom he alone was acquainted. At the same time he took care, for fear of alarming the receivers, not to disclose the histories or the value of the confided articles, but in each case he paid a sum of money down, upon the understanding that none of the valuables, under any circumstances, should be delivered up to anyone but himself. Most of the individuals he thus trusted had been the old lord's boon companions, men not too particular as to how they earned a few pounds, and also they lived, most of them, at a convenient distance, some even abroad. Meanwhile, pains were taken that no memoranda should be left, either to indicate the whereabouts of the valuables, or in any way to facilitate their recovery. Thus, when their owner died suddenly a year or two later, there was a tremendous hue and cry in the family. What had become of the missing articles, which were all mentioned in the heirloom list? No one could say. The trouble, expense, and difficulties, therefore, attending the discovery and recovery of all these treasures would certainly, had he been cognizant of them, have fully satisfied the offended father's revengeful malice. By dint, however, of advertising, calling in detectives, and other methods, every valuable was at last restored, save one, namely, the picture which was now hanging in my writing room. For quite 2 years it could not be traced. It was mentioned once in the catalogue as the portrait of the old lord's great-grandfather, the ancestor from whom most of the family property had accrued, and once again in the family annals, an old volume carefully treasured in the charter room, in which the said gentleman was invariably styled "ye wicked lord." Of this appellation he seemed to have been aware, and he was as proud of it as of the beauty of his person, which was renowned. The missing portrait was mentioned in the list as the crimson portrait, and my husband could only just remember it, as it had always, during his boyhood, hung in a room very rarely used, and situated at the top of the house. A curious cipher, now faint from age, was bracketed to the name of the portrait in the list. It resembled the well-known jettatura sign of the hand, with outstretched first and fourth fingers, supposed by superstitious persons to exorcise the evil eye. Every means were taken, at the time of the old lord's demise, to discover this picture, but in vain, and my husband began to despair of tracing it. But one day he received a foreign letter from a certain Joseph Hoffmann, who stated that, in consequence of a long absence from home, he had not heard of the old lord's death, nor had he seen the advertisements about the missing picture. Indeed, he stated that he had forgotten all about the painting until he noticed it on his return, quite lately, rolled up in his lumber yard. He wished now to return it to its owner. "Will your lordship come yourself," Joseph wrote, "and fetch it? For I have something very particular to communicate, for your lordship's ear only. Pray come quickly, for I am a dying man." There was a postscript added. It is carefully rolled up, with the words, "The Crimson Portrait," written on the cover, J.H. My husband was overjoyed at this news, and much mystified. So he traveled himself, as requested, to the village of Isgam in Belgium. But on entering the house, he was informed that Joseph Hoffmann had died an hour before his arrival. The poor man's son, however, was there, apparently overwhelmed with grief, and on seeing my husband, who produced Joseph's letter, he delivered up the picture, acting, as he said, upon his father's orders. "He expected to see me, did he not?" asked my husband. "He did, my lord," answered the youth, "and was looking for you all yesterday and the day before." "Did he leave no message for me?" "None, my lord." But as the young man helped to put the picture into the hired conveyance, and bade my husband a courteous farewell, he devoutly crossed himself and said, in French, he was glad to get rid of the picture, as they had had no luck, at least, so his poor father had said, ever since it had been in their keeping. Although my husband distinctly heard the youth say these words, he only remembered them later, and upon his return home, as soon as we conveniently could, we obtained the help of a competent picture dealer, who carefully unrolled the canvas and pronounced the picture in almost perfect preservation. "Almost," echoed my husband. "Why almost? Is it damaged in any way?" "Well," answered the old man, after cautiously examining the picture in all lights, "there is this one spot here," indicating with his finger, "there, in that corner, and spreading towards the front, which seems curiously faded." "But why?" interrupted I, scarcely noticing the old dealer's words. "Why should it be called the Crimson Portrait, when the gentleman it represents is dressed from top to toe in russet brown? There is not a touch of crimson in the whole picture. In fact, the painting exhibited a distinguished-looking man, clad entirely in brown. He faced the spectator, and his head was slightly turned to the right, as though in a listening attitude, while an amused smile curled his lips. The features were fine, rather of a Mephistophelian type, but the smile was that of Mephisto, in a pleased humor. On the left of the picture was painted a balcony opening to a garden beyond, while at the back a dark curtain was represented, which half disclosed a paneled door. The wicked lord seemed in the act of passing through a marble-pillared hall, and some sound appeared to have arrested and amused him, for he was apparently pausing for a moment, as he stood on the black and white tessellated pavement. "It is a magnificent work of art," reiterated the picture dealer, without noticing my query, "but that faded corner is a blemish. It has the effect of a shadow in the wrong place. Shall I try to clean it, or might I touch it up a little?" "Heaven forbid!" ejaculated my husband, who had a righteous horror of any touching up. Then, fearful lest he might have hurt the old man's feelings, he added that he had gone to so much expense lately over the picture that he must wait a little before doing more. Then arose the question, where should it be hung? In my writing room, I implored. The wicked lord is scarcely a suitable companion for my gentle little wife, laughed my husband, but she shall have her way. So, to my delight, I was permitted to appropriate the picture, and it was forthwith hung exactly opposite my writing table. Weeks elapsed, and I had become quite accustomed to the wicked lord's society, while the portrait's disappearance and recovery were now ancient history and quite forgotten. And here we are, having arrived at the point in the narrative whence I started. I was sitting one morning writing. The letter was one of medium importance, and, finding myself at a loss for the moment for a suitable word, I began, with much lack of originality, first to nibble at the top of my pen, then to gaze casually and vaguely about me at nothing in particular. Suddenly I glanced upward at the portrait, and was struck by a very curious change which appeared to have come over that portion of it which the old dealer had pronounced faded. I watched it narrowly for some seconds, just to convince myself that I was the victim of no illusion, no fancy. But no, the strange shadow, though still gray and misty, was undoubtedly deepening and changing in color, and to my further amazement, as I looked, it, the shadowy appearance, took the form of a woman. She was crouching on the ground, close behind the man in brown, and it gave one the idea that she had crept noiselessly, as she thought, through the curtained door, but that the brown man, as evinced by his listening attitude and contemptuous smile, was perfectly aware of her presence. Gradually the drapery around the woman's figure assumed a faint but ever-deepening crimson, and I could now distinguish that she held something concealed in her hand, but I failed to discern what. For a moment I stood in stupid astonishment at the misty object. Then I closed and rubbed my eyes and looked again. Yes, there it was still. So, with really praiseworthy courage, I rose and approached it. But as I did so, the woman's figure began to melt away. I was close enough, however, to put my hand out and touch it, and how foolish I felt. There was nothing there but canvas and paint, and the brown man was looking on at me with his insulting, amused smile. Much irritated, and not to say alarmed, I returned to my writing, but my heart beat as though it must burst, and I trembled in every limb. For some minutes, however, I obstinately wrote on. Then, feeling impelled to look up once more, I saw the awful shape becoming each moment more and more distinct, for I now made out what the woman held in her hand, which was so tightly clenched as to show every bone in it. It was a dagger. Her drapery had once more deepened in color, and was now of a vivid crimson, but what, I think, alarmed me the most was the fact that, although her face was turned toward the wicked lord, her glittering eyes were apparently watching me with a curiously threatening expression, as though, panther-like, she were only awaiting my least movement to spring. With a terrified gasp, and expecting I know not what, I rose again to my feet. "I can bear this strain no longer," I whispered. "I must get away out of the room. But how to pass that woman?" Making one ineffectual step forward, I stumbled and fell down unconscious. I cannot have lain there many minutes, for when I came to myself I was still alone, still on the ground close to the picture, with the blood oozing from a deep scratch on my arm. My nerves by this time were totally unstrung, an excuse for the fact that, at the moment, nothing earthly would have persuaded me but that the panther woman herself had wounded, scratched me, with the dagger, of course. As I rose from the ground, I cast a terrified glance at the picture, and thanked heaven that but one figure was now perceptible, and that it was the brown one. With a sobbing prayer I hastened by, out of the room, anxious to feel myself within hail of any humans, husband, children, or servants, I cared not which. I had had enough of superhumans. Becoming calmer, I sought my husband, but he was out, and after a quiet cogitation, I determined I would put off relating to him my extraordinary experience, for I felt intuitively that, were he to believe it, and me, it would annoy him, but that, on the other hand, if he disbelieved it and thought it only my fancy, he would ridicule me. And if there is one thing I dislike more than another, it is ridicule, or to be accused of hysterical fancies. All the same, I was resolved upon one point. Come what might, I would never be alone with that picture again. It must be removed out of my room, and at once. But what reason, unless I gave the true one, could I give for such an apparent caprice? I had made such a point of having it in my sitting room. That there was something demoniacal about the painting I had not a doubt, and a mystery also. Otherwise, why should it be mentioned in the list as the Crimson Portrait when, in its normal state, there was no tinge of crimson to be seen? No, the people who wrote that list must have known. There was certainly something uncanny about it. So, come what might, the wicked lord and his ferociously crimson lady must part company with me, and at once. Very quickly, chance, or, more strictly, a beneficent providence, came to my aid in the matter, and on that very evening it happened thus. We had a small dinner party, and among the friends we had invited was the great Royal Academic Sir F.L. In the course of conversation, my husband related to his guest the odd story of the portrait's disappearance and subsequent recovery. Thereupon, the Royal Academic expressed a wish to make the Brown Lord's acquaintance, and after having done so, he pronounced the picture a work of art of great value, but, he added, he considered it badly hung. It is too large, he said, for where it is placed, and also it is in a bad light, for, if you remark, there is a curious shadow in the corner of it, which looks as if it were faded, and this would not show so much if it were hung in the dining-room among the other portraits. Put it over the fireplace, there, where the mirror is now. But, objected my husband, my lady wants the picture in her room. I hastened at once to assure him, with much apparent self-abnegation, that I would not for the world condemn such a valuable picture to a place unworthy of it, and after much praise for my unselfishness, its removal was decided on. Just before the Royal Academic finally bade us good night, he said, "Did I not perceive a rod and running rings fixed around the frame of the picture, as though a curtain had at some point been hung across it?" My husband answered that, now that he thought of it, there was a dark velvet curtain in the room upstairs, which probably was the one, for embroidered in its corner was the same cipher as that which was to be seen opposite the portrait's name in the catalogue. "May I see the curtain?" asked the Royal Academic, and after examining it, he laughed and said, "It is to be hoped there is no diablerie attached to the portrait, as the cipher might suggest, for, don't you see, it is the jettatura?" I could see from my husband's manner that this half-jest from a comparative stranger was distasteful to him, for his only weakness, and a very small one, was an over-sensitiveness regarding his family and ancestors. They were, in his eyes, too sacred to be joked about, or even lightly spoken of. So the Royal Academic was not invited again for some time. The picture was removed into the drawing-room at once, but, bearing in mind the conversation just narrated between my husband and the Royal Academic, I again put off my confession to the former, judging it would be irritating to him, and wanting in tact in me, were I to relate my experience just now. I will bide my time, I thought, and perhaps the beautiful murderess, for that her intentions were or had been at one time murderous, who could doubt, or wherefore the dagger, may shrink from rehearsing her bloody attempts in an apartment so consistently full of guests as our dining-room. I confess, however, that I never entered the room alone if I could help it, nor could I glance at the picture without a shudder. One evening we had a large dinner party in honor of the engagement of a young girl to a cousin of my husband. We had a very merry meal, and during the entertainment my husband related the story of the picture and its recovery, as I thought he was too fond of doing, for I always tried to forget the horrid thing and all about it. Consequently, all eyes had been turned admiringly towards it, except my own, for I always sat with my back to it, if I could so manage without disarranging the symmetry of the table. When the time came for us ladies to rise and leave the gentlemen to their wine, it was suggested that before we left the room we should drink the health of the happy fiancés, Highland fashion, that is, standing, the man with each one foot on the table. This was done with acclamation, and as we were filing out of the room, the poor little promise electrified us all by giving a piercing shriek and, without further ado, fainting on her lover's shoulder. We carried her at once to an open window in the next room, sending everyone away, and she soon recovered, but seemed to be laboring under extreme terror, and I noticed that she was evidently greatly relieved at finding herself in a different room. I made a shrewd guess, therefore, as to the cause of her alarm. She had been placed at dinner exactly opposite the picture, and upon my pressing her to tell me if anything had frightened her, she whispered in my ear just what I expected to hear. "That picture," she sobbed out hysterically, "that horrid, horrid picture! And oh, that terrible woman! Where did she come from? And those wicked, malicious, glittering, leering," each word screamed louder than the last, "eyes! I shall never, never forget them, nor her. Oh, where's Ernest? You sat with your back," she meant, I presume, to the picture, "and didn't see it, but I did. But oh, where's Ernest? If he doesn't come directly, I shall go off again. Oh, oh." And she gave such indubitable signs of following out her intention that, after more salts, I packed her off in the brougham with her Ernest, in the hope that he would comfort her on the way home. "Anyhow," I overheard the old butler say confidently to my maid, "it has to be hoped it will stop her noise." After this, I felt I could keep my secret no longer, so I, then and there, and in the presence of the few guests who still remained, told my husband of my own experience, now so curiously corroborated by the unprejudiced and voluble witness as the young fiancé. As I foresaw, he was much put out, and being entirely at sea as to what measures he should take, or whether he should take any at all, he relieved himself by being angry with everybody. He was very angry with me because I had kept the story to myself, and, with praiseworthy consistency, was angrier still with that stupid, hysterical girl, as he called the little fiancée, because she had not. "Making such a row," he said, "and telling such a cock-and-bull story." Then, with sarcasm, he asked our startled guests whether any one of them had seen anything, and if any had, would they kindly speak, for now was their time. Had any other questionable individuals forced themselves into their society? But at that moment all were so much astonished at their host's unreasonable wrath, that had the devil himself and his angels appeared and claimed acquaintance, they would have shaken hands warmly with them all, rather than irritate their host further. After this outburst the guests all quickly dispersed, and my husband, in much annoyance, declared that there was nothing tangible in the story, nor had I the courage to point out to him that the very fact of non-tangibleness was just the alarm gauge of all such coincidences. The picture, he declared, was like every other picture, so it was at that moment, and he would see everyone very far off before he would banish one of his most valuable paintings to the garrets in consequence of a love-sick girl's silly cackle. All the same, I saw he was uneasy, and knew his excitement would not last. So I waited, and when he got over it a little, I suggested his searching among the family records to find out all he could concerning the wicked lord and his familiars, and also that the curtain, which had been put away, should be replaced on the frame. "But," I diplomatically added, "it need not always be drawn, you know." My advice was taken. The curtain was rehung, and search was made among the old papers in the hope of finding out something. "Perhaps," my dear, noble-minded husband said, "we may discover some wrong, even after all these years, which it may be our happy lot to set right." One day, with a pale face and shaking hand, he brought me a manuscript, all torn and defaced by age, which told us everything, and more than everything, that we wished to know. It recorded a fearful tale of crime perpetrated by the wicked lord, and recorded threats of undying revenge on the part of the Crimson Lady. "We, alas," said my husband, after reading the manuscript, "can do nothing. No single creature is now living to whom we could make amends for our ancestors' sin. All we can do is to strive, by our own innocent lives, to wipe out the stain we have discovered. and certainly he acted up to this determination as far as he was concerned. The fact of shame being attached to the name of any ancestor of his, however remote, was to him a source of real pain and grief. He gave strict orders that the curtain should always be kept drawn in front of the portrait, and added that he would have it removed upstairs as soon as possible into the room where it originally hung. But one thing and another helped to put this decision out of his mind, until a circumstance occurred which hastened his action in the matter. We had dined late one evening, my husband and I, alone, and after dinner we had adjourned to the conservatory, which led out of the dining room. We sat there and had coffee. The servants, meanwhile, we could hear, had cleared away the dinner and put out the lights, and we sat silent, not to say sleepy. Suddenly we heard something, a sound which gave us both a violent start. It issued from the next room, a jingling noise, twice repeated, as of the rings of a curtain being suddenly and vehemently drawn aside. For a second we looked at one another. Then my husband rang the bell violently, and, springing for a light, he and I rushed into the darkened dining room. On entering, we perceived at once that the curtain which, during dinner, had certainly been drawn across the picture, was now wide open, both sides, and as we approached, we distinctly saw the crimson lady's glittering eyes positively shining at us through the semi-darkness, like those of an angry animal. As we drew closer, however, they became dimmer and went out, as it were, and we found ourselves standing opposite the wicked lord only, with his eternal smile. By this time the old butler, Simpkins, had entered the room, amazed at the vehemence of the summons which he had received. He was accustomed to taking things easily with Simpkins, and after a dignified fashion, for he was an old man whose father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all been in the family's service. Simpkins had never been known to be flurried or in an undignified hurry. Now he stood before his master, calmly inquiring, "Your lordship rang?" "Who has been in this room since you cleaned away?" angrily asked my husband. "Did I not give strict orders, too, that curtain—" The old man now perceived for the first time that the curtain was open, and turned pale. "Was to be kept drawn? Who dared to open it just now? It is some low trick, and I will find it out. Who has been here, I say?" "No one, my lord," answered the shaking Simpkins in an injured tone. "Your lordship's orders have always been carefully obeyed. No living soul," slightly emphasized, "has been here since dinner." My husband looked and was terribly perplexed. Simpkins being, as he felt, more of a friend than a servant, one whose family, too, had lived on the estate for as long as his own, and whose word was always to be trusted, could not for one moment be supposed capable of conniving at some low practical joke. How, then, was it possible to account for— "Your lordship's orders," repeated Simpkins emphatically, "have been obeyed to the letter, but it is my opinion, as well as that of my colleagues," it is impossible to adequately describe Simpkins' dignity as he said these words, "that it is the work of the evil one. We can't keep that curtain," Simpkins pronounced it cutting, "closed, do what we will. And we," looking apprehensively around and speaking in a terrified whisper, "have actually seen the hand that opens it, a woman's, and with a dagger in it." After such evidence as this, the picture was condemned to be banished, but none of the servants would aid in its removal. They were afraid to touch it, they said. So 2 strange workmen were called in to carry it upstairs. One had his foot badly crushed, the picture having slipped and fallen on it, while the other received a long, painful scratch on the arm, from a nail, he supposed. The nail, however, was nowhere to be found, and the scratch was exactly in shape, like the one that had once appeared on my arm. And then it was, when the portrait was again lodged in its garret, that my husband remembered and repeated to me the words that had fallen from young Hoffman's lips on the day that he brought away the picture from Belgium, words that he had scarcely noticed at the time. The end.